have a motion?
So moved.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Version, passes unanimous. Item number 3, Transportation Improvement Program Amendment number 2022.050. I believe we have a staff presentation. Jamie Brown.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. This is an action item which would amend the fiscal year 2022 through 2026 PAG Transportation Improvement Program. It's a combination of adjustments to the ADOT projects in the TIP, as well as the outcome of work conducted by the TIP subcommittee to adjust programming for federal STBG, as well as state highway user revenue funds on RTA roadway element projects. The amendment was presented to the TPC at the February 22nd meeting. There was discussion about making some changes to the amendment because there are 13 items and 2 items were recommended for removal. But it is staff's recommendation to reinsert one of those items so that we maintain fiscal constraint for all the other projects on the roadway element project list. And also that one project that was recommended for removal is one of the 4 projects that was recommended for deferral. And so by taking that amendment out, it would maintain the funding on that particular project, which would keep us out of fiscal constraint. So again, we recommend putting that particular project back on the list so that we maintain fiscal constraint. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Chair, I appreciate the opportunity to just address that briefly. So the project pulled off was the County River Road project, and Mr. Mogimi and I spoke about this after the EPC committee meeting, and I followed up with Catherine Skinner, our transportation director and the chair of the TPC, just to get an understanding. And it's not that the county doesn't think the TIP amendment should proceed. We're supportive of that proceeding. There are some changes, I think, in how the TIP amendments are presented from the way they were provided in the past, and the information showing comprehensively where the dollars are coming from and where they're going to. And so that was more of the reason for asking that item be pulled than the county not supporting it. So I just want to make that known on the record.
Thank you. Any questions or any more discussion? None? I hear any motions?
So move approval of the amendment.
Do I have a second? Second. All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay. Motion passes unanimously. All right, moving to item number 4. Thank you, Mr. Brown. So I think you're up again. So Transportation Improvement Program Development Process Update for fiscal year 2024 through fiscal year 2028 and draft project list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to provide with an update on our process for developing the fiscal year 24 through 28 TIP, as well as the draft project list that is in your packet. As you all are probably aware, the TIP is a prioritized listing or program of transportation projects that's developed and formally adopted by PAG, the region's metropolitan planning organization. It covers a 5-year period, and per federal regulations, the TIP must be updated at least every 4 years. So the current FY22 through 2026 TIP, which was approved in May of 2021, continues to be in effect and will continue to be a document that we can amend to make sure that projects continue moving forward with any necessary amendments. There are several factors that make this particular process unique. And so there are several key considerations we wanted to share with you this morning. So as you all know, the RTA board is committed to completing all of the RTA roadway element projects. This is also the first TIP that includes program years beyond the sunset of the current RTA plan. So in previous TIP development cycles, programming of funds on RTA roadway element projects was guided by the RTA plan funding targets per the ballot amounts. Now, without those ballot amount targets as a kind of a cheat sheet, if you will, because those have been met, each of the programming adjustments will need to be made on a case-by-case basis as funding is identified. And it will be the RTA funds that will be programmed based on the RTA board's sole discretion. Also important to note, because of these factors, that there's less flexibility to simply roll over or park funds on projects, regardless of whether or not they're being actively managed for moving forward to construction. Because again, we're going to need to be programming on a case-by-case basis. So currently, we're doing what we can to develop the fiscal year 2024 through 2028 TIP, understanding that we cannot complete the programming for fiscal years 27 and 28 until programming of projects in 24, 25, and 26 is complete. And decisions and outcomes related to RTA Next will impact programming in 27 and 28, with RTA Next as an anticipated funding source. But we may recommend delay of adoption of the TIP if we do not have enough information or until significant decisions are made by the PAG Regional Council RTA Board regarding RTA Next revenues. So there's been a lot of committee activity since last fall, including meetings of the Transportation Plan Committee, the TIP Subcommittee, and the Transit Working Group. So we want to thank all those committee members for their time and effort thus far. So for the TIP Subcommittee, the focus has been on the RTA roadway element project list and fiscal years 24, 25, and 26. So the committee has reviewed and provided updates on project readiness and cost estimates. They've reviewed and approved revenue projections and a fiscal constraint table for state HERF 12-6 funding, as well as federal STBG funding. And they've reviewed and approved RTA roadway element project list to program those federal STBG and state HERF dollars. So we're currently incorporating comments from the TPC members on that draft list that was in your packet. So what you're seeing in your packet is currently being adjusted. We presented the tip list to the TPC on February 22nd, had a good discussion, and later reached out and asked for comments in writing by last week, March 1st. And so again, we're incorporating those comments. So the list in your packet is a little bit outdated, but we wanted to present it to you for your information. And also it's important to know that it's a combination of several different lists you can see on the screen. So it includes ADOT project list, the RTA roadway element project list, a couple of transit lists, etc. And so the list in your packet for comparison purposes includes what's already approved in the current TIP, as well as what's proposed. So it's a very long list in terms of the number of pages. But once it moves through the process, we're only going to show what is proposed for funding and not both what's existing and proposed. So we can condense that list down to about 6 projects per page instead of 1 project per page. With that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Any questions? Mr. DeBonis?
Jamie, so the programming of the 27 and 28 year funding by the RTA board, is that going to be on as a discussion topic at this month's RTA board meeting?
Yes, so we'll provide the same update. I mean, as part of that conversation, obviously, we want to get more direction from the board.
And so if I may, if there's not direction given at the March meeting, what does that mean to the schedule? Because suggested in here is that there may be a delaying of adoption of a new TIP.
Yep. So back in the fall, we had that conversation with the regional council. Again, keep in mind, RTA board focuses on the RTA side of the business. TIP is under PAG side of the business. So we had this conversation with the regional council at the time that potentially we may want to continue working on developing the TIP itself and then bring it to the regional council for approval when it's done. Normally, we try to do it in May prior to the end of the fiscal year. There's really no reason to do that. We can bring it to the regional council in August or October. So really the key, I think, question to ask here is, are we all comfortable with what we're going to plug into 27, 28? And at this point, we don't have all the information that we need or the direction we need from RTA board, what to do with the remaining RTA projects. So that is really the biggest question to continue to work towards. 25, 26, 27 is starting to look good. We're starting to fall in place. 27, 28, still to be seen and have that conversation with the RTA.
So if I may, is the board going to see recommendations from staff or from the subcommittees in terms of how to program those $27 and $28 to help meet the RTA needs?
Once we have direction from regional council, then yes, but we don't have that direction currently. Last time we had this conversation, I believe it was in December. And the understanding was that we're not going to program 27, 28 until we get more direction from the regional council.
So leads me to a question of what has delayed that happening since the conversation in December to where we are now. It seems like the parking of that conversation has not lined up with the original intent to have a tip approved, and that is self-inflicting, right? A potential delay in adoption of the tip.
Well, Mr. Chair, if I may, just for everybody's benefit, the goal of having the tip adopted by May is an internal goal. When we had this conversation back in October, I did mention that to the regional council that may not be our goal this time around because we need more time to work through some of these issues. The 4 projects that are delayed or deferred, those are the ones that we need more direction from the board. How do you want to handle those 4 projects in 27, 28? And that's well known. They're, at least on my conversations with a few members, they are motivated and interested. As Jamie said earlier, our goal is to plug in funds for those projects in 27, 28. How to do it, we need direction from the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know to whom this is, but help me understand part of the process here too, because obviously not being the transportation person, I look at the list and go to our staff and say, is this lining up? And what I'm getting feedback is that it either has some errors still in reflecting what we believe is accurate on the project, or maybe not all the projects are on the list. So where are we in the process to finalize or to firm up the tip recommendations or whatever would then go on to the board?
Chair, if I may. So it's all draft until we cross the T's, dot the I's.
Just add all the Hemi
finalize
County
it.
projects.
You keep adding things until the committees recommend to move forward with it. So at this point, I think based on the conversations we've been having, all the committee discussions, all the pieces are falling in place. The ADOT portion, that's a little bit easier. There's no RTA funds involved with the ADOT portion. So that one I would say is pretty complete, and Rod can tell me if he thinks it's near completion or not, but we know we still have to cross the T's, dot the I's on the ADOT projects. Transit projects are pretty complete. So it's really the RTA named projects that we still need to determine how we want to deliver projects now. TIP is just on paper, actual delivery. So working with our folks who have projects in 24, 25, 26, we believe we're able to start moving those projects forward. So working with Robin and Sam, I think we're moving the projects that are going to be under construction in 24. That's our goal. And then 25 and then 26. So 27, 28 is still on paper, and we still have time to
So we
resolve
still have
those.
time
We have
for the
time to
tip
resolve
to
those.
review and finalize recommendations.
Yes. Yes.
If I may just on that, but not within the historic timeframe for doing it.
Say that again.
Not within the historic timeframe for adopting the tip.
Story time.
And in accordance with the schedule that we received previously. And so I don't recall us hearing an update that there was a potential for not adopting the tip on schedule that, this body had been briefed on.
I believe at the last tip update we provided the same information that we've been having that conversation with regional council. And again, keep in mind what's different. What's different is that RTA expires in 26. For the first time, now we have a tip that has 2 years beyond RTA expiring. And the question is, how do we handle those 2 years? And so this has never happened before. This is the first time that we're dealing with that situation.
So if I may, is the TPC being asked to provide recommendations into that, or is it not a subject of discussion for the TPC to have? Are we waiting for the RTA board absent any recommendations being given to them or scenarios for how to fill that need?
So far, we've been working on 24, 25, 26 with all the committees, including TPC. 27, 28 are the 2 years we're waiting for direction from regional council on RTA. Once we have that direction, then we can take it back to the committees.
And that just brings me back to when is that direction, right, being calendared for you? You said that there will be the same update given to the RTA board, but there may not be an action item on there. There's no recommendation for them.
We'll
to
have the
act.
same discussion and request for direction. So I think, again, I think that's the difficult part right now. To give you an example, federal funds in 27, 28. As we know, currently, there are no RTA projects that are federalized in 27, 28. So we need direction how to handle that, for example. That's just one.
Just closing comment, if we begin with the end in mind and the schedule was laid out to get to an end point, what were the steps necessary to get there? And it looks like there's some float in there to say it's okay if we don't adopt an updated tip, and that if that spills to the fall, and then what steps will be taken to ensure that happens, or are we going to skip it altogether?
That'll be a regional council decision. Again, every time we lay out schedules, there's always a footnote subject to change. And we're always vocal enough about it to tell everybody that it is subject to change. Really, we want to get it right. We want to make sure it's complete before we move it forward to regional council. At this point, if you don't have RTA dollars in 27, 28, it'll be an incomplete tip. So that's one of the discussions we want to have with the board.
Starting.
I'm not understanding how you're expecting to go to the regional council for direction, either from the RTA board or the regional council, without a recommendation on what the scenarios would look like so that they could choose. Because what Carmine asked is, what's the recommendation for those? And you said there is none, because it's going to be up to them to make a decision. How can they make a decision without having some understanding and guidance, either from the committees or from the RTA staff? I don't understand that.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, so the recommendation at this time is that we're going to continue to move forward, continue to use the amendment process to move projects forward. At some point along this next, at least let's say 6 months between now and end of summer. During this time, we'll have enough information to come back and recommend when we need to adopt the tip. We do not need to adopt a tip. The only reason we want to adopt the tip is to make sure that we have made those decisions and plugged in 27, 28. At this point, we don't have a recommendation for 27, 28, but we will get there. 25 and 26 are much more critical. We want to make sure we get those projects plugged in and fully programmed. So it's first time we've had this situation that we do not have funds for 27, 28. RTA dollars go away. We do not have funds. We don't have the funds to plug it in. So we have to have that conversation with the board. My recommendation to the board, even back in the fall, was that we need to delay adoption. What does delay mean? I think by fall, we'll get there.
I don't remember a recommendation that you would delay. I think there was conversation about that as potential. I just don't remember the nuance of that recommendation. What is the statute? What is the statute or the requirement for a tip? What is it outlined? What is
We have
statutory requirement?
every 4 years we're required to update our tip. So last time we updated our tip was 21, May of 21.
So we have until 25 to adopt.
Yeah, we got plenty of time.
So even though annually we adopt it,
That was just our own decision.
so I think that might answer part of your question, which is the statute requires it in 25.
Yes, so by May of 25, we need to have an updated tip.
Updated tip, and it sounds like we don't have to have one. I still go back to my nervousness about the lack of a recommendation for those last 2 years, because that's a conversation that we've had, and not only at this group, but also TMC about exactly that issue and outlining that.
So we'll have to work through those issues and with direction from the board, come back and decide how to handle that. Again, the federal funds are a good example. If there are any RTA projects that can be federalized in 27, 28, we want to know that sooner than later, and that'll be the recommendation to the board. Federalize these two projects, utilize those federal funds in 27, 28 for those two projects, for example. We don't have that recommendation yet. We have to get there.
I think the clock's ticking is what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
On the presentation, can you go back to key considerations? First key consideration slide. The fourth bullet point. I'm not following that bullet point as it relates to delivery of the program on a macro scale, which is what we're talking about. Walk me through that.
Yeah, so, excuse me, so the tip is updated on a biennial cycle every 2 years. So last cycle,
What was that?
biennial every 2 years, because I think I heard.
No, it's not required. Is that right?
Correct. We could do it annually, biannually, every 4 years.
Or not
Federal
doing it.
Code of Federal Regulations says must be updated at least every 4 years. So yeah, that slide is basically reflecting again, one of the different factors that's affecting this particular tip cycle, because last cycle, again, we had those RTA roadway and targets based on the ballot amounts to work with. And so that was really, we had a worksheet and we said, okay, these projects on the ballot have this target. Let's apply HERF, let's apply RTA, let's apply SDBG to get to that target. We've met all those targets. And so now, because the key point at the very top, it says the RTA board is committed to completing all these RTA roadway element projects. So now we're talking about supplementing on all these projects, right, as necessary. But funding is constrained, there's limited funding, and also costs are increasing. So we don't want to move forward with looking at 26 and putting funding on projects if we don't know that that project is ready for construction and we don't have the latest and greatest cost estimates. So that's why we're doing it on a case-by-case basis. And I guess I should correct that, because for 24, 25, and 26, we actually did program HERF and SDBG, but there's still some funding gaps. And it'll be the RTA excise tax that will likely be the source that will meet the additional needs of those projects. And so there are projects that still have needs for 24, 25, and 26, and RTA funds are really only programmed by the RTA board. So it will be the RTA board that helps decide how to meet those funding gaps.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. Thank you. What makes me nervous, though, is that if you focus on the ballot amount, which is what that appears to, am I misreading that?
If I
Go ahead,
may,
please.
Mr.
Maybe I misread it.
That was the case in the previous TIP development cycle. We were focusing on the ballot amounts. And so now, and this is a new cycle, it's different. We're beyond that. We've met all of that previously. So now we're supplementing funding. We're going beyond the ballot amount going forward. So we don't have a cheat sheet that was already sort of pre-approved by the RTA board to work with. So now for each project, it will be up to the RTA board to say, yes, we approve additional funding on this project at this amount. And so that's why it's going to be a case-by-case basis, is my understanding.
I think that's right on point, just to add a little bit more context to it. So, and you touched on it. So the context is, we have a project in 26 that needs $10 million. Should we plug that $10 million on that project and hold it? Or should we identify projects in 24 that need funding and use that $10 million to deliver projects? So that's the decision the board needs to make, that let's deliver projects, let's put those funds on the projects that are ready to go and not park it 2-3 years out, so we can deliver projects as we go. And again, the context was previously we had a target. Now there is no target, it's a moving target. And that's a moving target that the board will decide. Do you add $10 million to that project, or do you add $20 million? The answer is whatever we need. So as we know what those numbers are, we'll take it to the board, and the board will identify supplemental funds for those projects in that given fiscal year instead of 3 years out, instead of parking the money 3 years out. So pay as you go approach, basically.
Mr. Chairman, I'm good with pay as you go, as long as there's clarity that is the first bullet point, which is delivery of the program.
Yep.
Because as I saw the IGA for North First Avenue, it still shows the old amount, which was not the current projected amount. That is a flag for me when I read that, which, yeah, you can scrounge and scrape to make up that cost, but if it's not the delivery of the program and that project that's outlined, whatever those costs are,
Yep.
then we fail. And that's what I'm trying to get to is, I understand the shell game, but all I'm saying is at the end of the day, the delivery of the program, the first bullet point is the key piece to it. How you get there, be my guest, but ultimately that's where I'm gonna stay focused. And when I hear valid amount, it's a flag for me to say, hey, time out here. We all know those costs are greater than that in most instances. And that's really the focus of mine.
Mr. Chair, if I may, again, more context. Prior to last year, we never had to go above those targeted amounts. We did last year with Tangerine, Sunset, Downtown Links. So that's the approach moving forward. Projects that need additional funding, we'll add additional funding to those projects moving forward.
Thank you. Any further discussion? None? Okay. Mr. Brown. Moving to item number 5, Regional Transportation Revenues Update, David Zinda.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the Management Committee. Pleasure to be speaking with you. Yes, David Zinda, Program and Policy Manager or Coordinator, promoted myself here at PAG. Okay, so in terms of looking at some regional revenues in your packet, you'll see in the actual item memo itself, some of our recent RTA TBT revenue budget performance. I think since we last met, maybe in December, we've added January's numbers just shy of 10 million, sitting at about 9.7 million. For the total for the year, for 7 months into the 12-month fiscal year, we're at 67,500,000 roughly. Going to the main bulk of the report, when it comes to the Highway User Revenue Fund, year to date, total regional funds received not only on our ledgers on PAG 2.6 and 12.6, but also your direct HERF, we're looking at about 101,731,000. Compared to 2022 at this time of year, we're about 1.29% higher. 5-year average, we're looking pretty nice at about 11% compared to that average. Going to table 3, you can see our detailed month by month HERF 12.6 report. Subtotal this year so far is about 16.4 million. And compared to last year, we're about up 5% roughly. Table 4, HERF 2.6. So far, we have just shy of 3.6 million in our accounts, up from what would have been projected by ADOT, as well as what we had received last year. Table 5 is going to show our HERF 12.6 balance, what remains on our ledger. So you can see as of January 2023, we are showing about 57.5 million accumulated in those accounts, year-over-year gain of 55%. In terms of gasoline sales, table 6 and figure 2, there's really nothing anomalous or out of the ordinary to note there. We're hovering around the 13% of gas sales in the county compared to the state, which is right where we should be. With that, I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
All right, thank you, Mr. Zinda. Any questions? And I just want to check. I just want to check with the people online as well as everybody has had the opportunity to weigh in on these topics. You know.
Yes. Yep, I don't see any hands up, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Mr. Zinda. Moving on to item number 6, update on the development of the fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025 FEMA Association of Governments overall work program. Mr. Brown again.
Good morning again. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it's a pleasure to provide an update on developing the fiscal year 2024 and 2025 PAG overall work program. Some of you are very familiar with this. We take this through every other year. But for those of you who are new to OWP, it's a statement of work or scope of work that is required as the basis of contract with ADOT and consists of federally required transportation planning programs for the region, as well as other PAG programs and their respective goals. The overall work program, or OWP, must be aligned with state and federal funding source requirements and is approved by ADOT. It's in effect for 2 years, and that will be on July 1st, 2023. The currently adopted 2021 OWP serves as the basis for the overall. Federal requirements for a work program are described in the Code of Federal Regulations and includes requirements such as including PAG's planning priorities and proposed work, the organization designated to perform the work, and the schedule for completing the work, resulting products, proposed funding by activity and task, and the summary of total amounts and sources of federal and matching funds. It's important to keep in mind that there are restrictions on activities by fund source. So the revenues are derived from a variety of fund sources. So we've got federal, state, and local sources. And we must comply with all the federal requirements for an MPO. We also must comply with the terms of the agreement with ADOT. So that really restricts the activities that we do because of the requirements for each fund source. And as shown here on your screen, ADOT has primary responsibility for administering FHWA and RTA funds allocated to the MPO and ensuring that such funds are expended for eligible cost purposes and activities. So related to that, it's important to note that although we're a regional organization, we're limited in terms of what we can do based on our mission and our guiding documents. There was a memo that was shared with various parties back in 2021 as part of a legal opinion on extraneous matters that was updated by Mayor Joe Winfield and released last month. That memo talks about the fact that it's PAG's administrative staff that have delegated the responsibility to develop the scope of the contract in coordination with ADOT. And the legal memo talks about PAG being a nonprofit corporate entity and being legally bound by its founding documents, federal and state regulations, and funding agreements. So that's really important to note because we must carry out specific tasks aligned with our core mission, and we're engaging in extraneous matters that can expose PAG to legal risks. So the priorities for this OWP that we're working on, and you can see there's a draft in your packet. Well, it's really the same in terms of the current OWP. We're really going to focus on completing the 2006 RTA plan projects and advancing RTA next plan development for public feedback and voter consideration. Also, the long-range transportation plan, the 2055 RMAP development is another priority. Filling any obligations due to existing contracts or federal and state mandates, as well as data and technical tools to support these efforts are all of the priorities for the next 2 fiscal years. In terms of the structure of the OWP, it's largely the same as the current structure. It's going to include an introduction to regional planning background and overview, program area and work elements, and the appendices that you see on your screen, an organizational chart, federal planning factors, accomplishments and highlights, and revenue and expenditure tables. The revenue and expenditure tables are not included in your packet, but we hope to include those in the packet that goes to regional council. We're not quite ready. The program areas again are the same as the current OWP we proposed, and as shown on your screen, including transportation activities, etc. And within those different work program areas, we have various work elements, each with a description of the purpose, the funding sources, the projected outcomes and estimated completion dates, goals and strategies. And the structure is the same as the current OWP. And so in terms of regional council approval, the next step is really to complete the draft budget, present the regional council, the draft to the regional council later this month, and then finalize and prepare the document for approval in May. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Open it up for questions and discussion.
Mr. Chairman, if I know it's come in, but it's only been a couple of days. I've not even had a chance to look at it yet. So I don't know about others, but what's our window for feedback or comment?
Anytime, feel free to send me your comments.
When are you,
But
anytime, but when is it?
we are taking the same document to the regional council for a review and comment as well. So I would say no later than March 23rd.
Bonus?
What is the schedule, right? So I mean, going back to the conversation we had about TIP, right? What are the milestones in the schedule?
So this one's different. This is required to be adopted prior to July 1 of 2023 because it establishes our new fiscal year in the contract with ADOT. So the schedule is to have it adopted by May.
And so is this committee being asked to give a recommend? Is this an action item? Is this an
No,
update?
review and comments, send me your comments, and we'll continue to have the conversation prior to adoption by regional council.
And so may I ask then, in terms of the committee input on it, what has that process been? So the TPC, what is the process?
So as Jamie mentioned earlier, we've had this conversation with our regional council chairs over the last few years. This is a contract. It's a negotiation between PAG and ADOT. And obviously making sure that we meet our requirements, whatever that we're required to do. ADOT will tell us what we're required to do on behalf of FHWA and FTA. So all those requirements will come down through ADOT. And then so basically you look at our previous adopted plan, I would say 80%, 90% of what's in the plan is required. These are things you have to do. And then there's about that 10, 15% that those are things that we don't have to do, but we do because it's a regional importance to us. So typically we start from the adopted document, look at it, update it, bring it to the regional council and management for feedback, and then ultimately go back and sit down with ADOT and say, these are the things that we want to continue to do. These are things that we know we have to do. So ultimately regional council has the authority to approve it. And between now and May, we'll take feedback from regional council and make adjustments as needed.
Yes. Was it, what I didn't hear in that is a formal role for the committees, right?
Yeah, because of the contract, the RTA regional council, I'm sorry, the regional council is the only body that acts on it.
What is the opportunity between today, March 9th and March 21st? What other opportunities are there for input? What I'm
Send me any comments you have between now and March 23rd. That'll be for the first revision. And then we'll come back for another version later on, potentially in April.
So similar to another conversation that we've had, if ADOT is right, the responsible lead on this, and the jurisdictions aren't consulted along the way, how then are we supposed to give substantive input into a document that's nearly fully baked?
I don't want to speak for you, but he's not the person who does that. There's another division that does that.
More of a planning function, it's all my fault.
Yeah, there's another division that handles that, but feel free to respond if you like.
Again, it goes through our planning function, which helps oversee the PAG and make sure that they're following federal guidelines. I think Farhan will best answer that, but I'm sure we'd be willing to answer any questions. Like, just bring those people forward if you'd like, and they can ask any questions. PAG is typically in the MPOs are typically able to manage these pretty well.
So again, feel free to send me any comments you have before March 23rd. We'll have the same discussion with regional council and then take any input, bring it back in April with another version, and then the final version in May.
Mr. Chair, if I may. So, I shared with Farhad that, there's a lot of expertise in our committees, right? We've got people with a lot of tenure in their roles in their organizations, and they can be a resource to this committee as well as the regional council and the RTA board. And it doesn't appear that we're fully utilizing that resource in having conversations along the way. And then, we get up against timelines, and this is a movable timeline, right? Because we have to have it done by July of 23.
But
The
July.
other timeline was more of a flexible timeline, right? And that one we could let slide off a little bit. And so I think that it's an important conversation for us to have as, right, a body about what the role of the committees are going forward. And if we can go back to the slide on the letter from the chair of the regional council, and I think to a point there, I'm aware that we have representatives on committees that have asked for items that are reflected in the overall work program to be agendized for discussion by the subcommittee, and they were told that it was not the right time or that they were not the right body to do that. And so I'm curious, the point about engaging in extraneous matters, right? What is considered an extraneous matter? And if there's something in the OWP that a committee is asking to be agendized for conversation, what's the process for enabling that to happen? Again, leveraging that expertise of our representatives on those committees.
Sure, Mr. Chair, if I may, there's several questions in there, so I'll try to start with this one. Unfortunately, and I mentioned this to the regional council, early on in 2020, as soon as the pandemic was identified as a major concern, we got a lot of requests for PAG to get involved with issues that we felt that we did not have the authority or we did not have the funding flavor that was eligible for getting involved with certain things. At the time, we worked mostly with the county administrator and obviously with the public health department. That is the agency that was authorized to take the lead. And so that's just one example. But PAG as a regional body, what should have been PAG's role in responding to the pandemic? That's where most of this stuff started from. A lot of requests. Can PAG do this? Can PAG do that with this flavor of money? And the response was, no, unfortunately we can't. No, unfortunately we can't. Ultimately, the chair at the time said, get a legal opinion from our attorney to make sure everybody understands that we cannot use federal or state funds that come to PAG for just about anything. So that's where that began. And then from that point on, because we had several new members, that conversation kind of carried on and the question kept coming up. So every chair since then, the last 3 chairs have put out memos to help explain that. So that's where it came. Remind me the other parts of your question. There were like 3 parts to it.
Can I interrupt?
No,
I mean,
absolutely.
just to get a follow-up there, thank you, because I get that PAG RTA is not the pandemic, but some of the requests I've seen, and that's why I'm trying to get clarity, may be about pavement management or our carbon reduction.
Yeah, we'll talk about, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't see that as extraneous. How do we
No,
know?
no, these are separate topics, obviously. So pavement management already in the current plan. And City of Tucson has been managing that on behalf of the region through a contract. The technology is getting old, the equipment's getting old. We've been working with Sam and his team to look at a transition opportunity and then see what we can do. My understanding is that that model is not something that the city is interested to continue. So we're going to have to come back and identify a new approach on how we want to handle that. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to budget for it. We're still going to budget for it, but how we're going to implement it yet to be seen.
And I think my question is more not what's the answer to the questions, but what is extraneous, I guess, in terms of getting.
Well,
some of
those
this-
were the examples
Okay.
previously.
Okay.
Recent examples, I can tell you, but I get requests all the time and I appreciate people asking, but on a case-by-case basis, I would say 80% of the requests that we get, mostly conversational, fall in that category that no, it's not eligible for federal funds. No, it's not eligible for RTA funds. RTA is easy. If it's not in the plan, we can't do it, right? So if it's not one of the categories, if it's not a named project, we can't do it.
Mr. McGee,
Chairman, I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, Mr. McGee, just, do you have more examples of what you've seen requested though, so we understand? I think.
I'll give you some, without naming names, and I'll give you some simple examples. Speed humps. Can RTA do speed humps? I don't think so. We don't have category for it. We don't have named projects for it. I don't know, help me out here. Any other examples anybody can
If I
think
may,
of?
I've heard some other requests. I don't know if they were formal requests, but could PAG get involved in homelessness issues?
Yeah, there,
Yeah, and also heat related issues. I think that's a public health issue that doesn't, we don't have a funding source for that. These are all worthy issues, but we just don't have funding sources, and also it's not part of our overall mission guiding documents.
I guess
Okay, thanks. And then I'm gonna get Mr. Ortega, then I'll go next. Mr. Ortega.
So I guess I'm confused. I have a copy of the memo that was sent from Chris's mayor to Chris. That's interesting.
How'd that go?
But
Didn't do direct.
it talks about the overall work plan.
Yeah.
Program. I think. Yeah. And the conversation that you all had is not about the work plan. It's about other requests, which, you know, I understand. We all get requests all the time that says, hey, would you, and then you obviously have to say no, because you can't get funding or whatever reason. I'm going back to the point that Carmine started with, which piqued my interest in. We have expertise. What this tells me is stay in your lane. That's what I read this to say. Maybe that wasn't the intent, but, you know, smacking folks around saying, what are you doing? You know, you shouldn't be asking questions. You should do what we're telling you to do. And oh, by the way, we don't need you because we do this negotiating with ADOT directly. That's how I read that. And I think the point is we have a lot of expertise, a lot of opportunity to have conversation around this to help inform and maybe even provide feedback other than give me comments up until May 23rd, or I'm sorry, March 23rd. It's like, that doesn't seem to be taking advantage of the opportunity that Carmine spoke to, which is not only the TPC, but also this group. So if it is in fact a PAG staff negotiated item with ADOT, fine, then don't put it on an agenda. Don't ask. If you're going to just do it, then I'm good with that. I mean, we do administrative things all the time. But the impression I got is you want comment, you want feedback, but only if it's within this tiny box. And I'm not following it. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm just
So, Mr. Chair,
simplistic.
yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may. So it is the latter negotiation, but then informing the group, still looking at our opportunities that where can we find a partner who is willing to take the lead, for example. And pavement management is a good example. Back in roughly 2010, City of Tucson had the expertise, had the team. They volunteered to take on that portion of the OWP to respond to that need for the region. So this is another opportunity. I'll use pavement management again as an example. Is somebody else willing to take the lead and do that? If not, then it's back on OWP, back on PAG, and then identifying a solution for implementing that regional program. So yes, it's for information, seeking feedback. Regional council ultimately approves it. ADOT, FHWA, FTA are the agencies that have the oversight. They tell us what we can and cannot do. And then, as I mentioned, there's that 10 to 15% that there is some flexibility. But even then, that's ultimately up to the regional council. In some cases, there's liability involved that they have to make that decision. There's a risk management component to it. So again, I hope I answered the question. Yes, seeking any input you have and hopefully integrate some of that input into the next version.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. That's an answer. I don't think that's the answer that really addresses the question, which is how do you take advantage of the expertise within the community structure? Your call. You're going to go to the board. That's fine. All I'm suggesting is to support really the conversation around, we all have the expertise. Why aren't we having a more robust conversation? And I don't understand the need for this. I'm sorry, I'm dense on that, but I don't understand how this conversation around extraneous matters affects the annual work plan. I'm not following that.
Yeah, so they're really different issues, and since this has been coming up every year, we want to just remind everybody of that concern. Going back to committees, yes, committees help us implement those programs Again, pavement management is a good example. If we decide to move forward with pavement management as being something different, that's a committee implementation. Then we go to the committee and say, all right, how do we want to implement this program moving forward? This is how we did it. How do we want to do it in the future? So that's where the committees come in.
Yeah.
Bonus.
I think that example underscores the whole point. So I understand, and Mr. Credio is on the TPC, and I believe he's asked on multiple occasions to have pavement management agendized for discussion by TPC. And Ms. Skinner, who is the chair of TPC, has also made that request. And others that are elements within the overall work program, such as the carbon reduction program, also have been requested to be placed on the agenda for discussion by the subcommittee, and that has not happened. So that, I think, is the disconnect that I'm seeing, is that we've got people representing the various member representatives of the organization, this body, but they're making requests to provide input. And so if there needs to be a discussion about who's going to step in if the city doesn't want to continue with pavement management, isn't that a perfect forum? And so that's the key from my perspective, is that, again, we're not utilizing, and, you know, we've got Mr. Credio here, we've got Ms. Skinner here, both capable of giving their perspective I'm sure on this, and would just ask the chair if he would, you know, entertain maybe inviting them to make some comments.
Mr. Chair, if I may respond to that. So the request was made and the response was that we're not ready to have that detailed discussion because our staff are coordinating with ADOT to identify what portion of that work ADOT is doing on our behalf. So staff responded to the committee telling them that we're not ready to have that conversation until we get feedback from ADOT. But yes, at some point, once we have that information, they will go back to the committee and they will have that discussion. So it's a kind of a dynamic situation. We don't know what we know until we have that information. Then we can go and talk about moving forward. And what are the options? The options are really that simple. You either contract it out or you have another entity who's willing to do what the city was doing, right? So that's an easy conversation. Those are the only two options. So if somebody else is willing to do it, we'll ask somebody else to take the lead. If nobody else is willing to do it, then let's go out and do an RFP and do a contract.
Mr. Chair, just one final point, and then I'm going to stop. But we're up against a hard deadline. So what we heard today is that the overall work program, right, has to be adopted by May. And so we've got a window to provide comment between now and the 23rd, and then it'll be updated, and then we'll be looking to get that adopted before July. And so we're condensing, we're compressing all of these discussions into an extremely short time frame when we've had a lot of runway, in my opinion, to have conversations that we're hearing. It wasn't the right time frame, but now we've got a really short time frame to provide input. Wouldn't it be great knowing going into the adoption of the overall work program, who's available to pick up the pavement management program or what approach we're going to take?
Mr. Chair, we've been having those conversations. It's not brand new discussion. The conversation started back in July because that's when the contract was up. Back then, working with the city, they said, yeah, equipment's getting old. We think we want to pass that on to somebody else. So that conversation has been taking place for 6 months. The decision point isn't in the OWP. The decision point is after July 1, what do we want to do? The line item is the same. The goal is the same. The outcomes are the same. But do you want to contract it or do you want to have someone else do it? That's the decision. And we have until July to make that decision.
Mr. Mogimi, real quick, there's been mention of a couple items that have not been placed, that have been requested, but not placed on an agenda.
Yep.
Is the goals, will those items be placed, and when
Yes,
do you expect those?
same thing. The response was that we're not ready because we don't have all the answers. We don't have a draft plan. Once we have a draft plan, then we'll be able to come back and have that conversation.
We just took them.
So now we have a draft plan. This is the first time we have a draft plan.
Mr. Chairman,
Sure, take it.
two things. One, so even though they're extraneous memo conversation title on it says PAG's overall work program.
Yeah.
So I think it is
Yeah.
exactly this, not something different.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, I'd be interested in hearing from the TPC chair. What's the issue that seems to, where there seems to be a disconnect? I'm not following that. And since there's comments due on by March 23rd, it's the last opportunity we're going to have as a group to hear that. So if you're up for it, maybe we can chair the TPC to make that.
I think I'm fine, but I would request that, brief comments if at all possible.
Fair enough.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Catherine Skinner. I'm the Transportation Director and County Engineer for Pima County and the Chair of the Transportation Planning Committee. And I will be brief. I usually try to be. So I will go over the 3 items that we have been asking for in TPC to agendize. Those are the pavement management program, which you've discussed at length, because we have heard conversation, but not had the opportunity to discuss in our open meeting what the plan is for the program. The county has delivered over $250 million of pavement repair work in the last 4 years and feel we're uniquely qualified to kind of share some of our lessons learned in delivering such a robust program and the type of data that is needed to support that type of program. The city, of course, has had many years of bonds and the new initiative now that they're launching. And so there's a good opportunity to share between our regional partners lessons learned and opportunities and how we can frame out those goals that are set forth in the overall work program. Another item is the carbon reduction program. That's an item of new funding. So it's not something that any committee has discussed to the state because it is a new federal funding stream. The EPAC committee, which is more of the environmental committee, has asked for that to be on their agenda. They probably are the key group that could provide expertise in that. But then that conversation would come up to TPC. We do have a member on TPC from the Pima County Department of Environmental Quality that could share the recap. She is also the chair of the EPAC subcommittee. Safety is another item we've asked recurrently to have on the agenda for TPC. As you all have heard, as we adopt our safety targets, there's an issue in this town with increased fatalities on our roadways, and TPC being made up of primarily transportation directors, public works directors, heads of capital programs. We're looking at this issue on a daily basis as a part of our job running these organizations. And we know that these solutions are regional solutions, that one entity can't fix the problem on their own because our public drives on all of our roads and they don't know when they're leaving Pima County, entering Marana, entering Oro Valley, entering the city, when they're on an ADOT facility. And so that is the value of TPC, is we have an opportunity to have discussion. I also want to note, we are very well aware and respect the committee structure. We're asking for discussion items. We're not asking for action. We want to have an opportunity to openly speak about these things because we know the concerns surrounding open meeting law. We're trying to have these conversations in another venue. That maybe is not the best plan. So that's really, those have been our main concerns, is the inability to get these issues just for pure discussion on a committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. So I think all of those items are in the annual work plan. I think those are of value to have a conversation, and this goes to the regional council. Again, if it's a negotiated contract between PAG staff and ADOT, have at it. But if you want those conversations to happen and feedback from that, I think the best conversation is for it to be in an open session. That's my thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Anything else related to this item? You, Mr. Brown. Item number 7, legislative updates. David Zinda.
Oh, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. in terms of the Arizona State Legislature, we're on day 59 since it began, I believe, in early January 9th, 10th, somewhere in that ballpark. Since then, we have had 1,600, almost 30 bills introduced. 18 have passed both chambers, most of those being budget bills, 15 vetoed, again, but most of those being budget bills, and 2 signed into law, one dealing with planning, housing affordability, and another one dealing with some tax changes, so nothing transportation related quite yet. The last day to introduce new bills, if I recall correctly, was on January 30th for the Senate, February 7th for the House. So if you're tracking anything and they haven't cleared those, or you won't see any new bills, I guess is what I should say, unless they come among unusual means. Last day for Senate bills to be considered in the Senate, House bills in the House was on February 17th, if memory serves correctly. So if you're tracking a bill, hasn't passed out of committee, it's probably not looking good for that bill. The last day for House bills to be considered in the Senate and vice versa is going to be March 24th, and the 100th day of the session, when it in theory should end, will be April 18th. As I mentioned earlier, budget bills were introduced this past month and each were vetoed by the governor. The failed transportation appropriations bills I want to highlight for you, Senate Bill 1535, included a provision that would prohibit state agencies and local governments from using HERB for projects that reduce capacity for motor vehicle travel. So that will be the theme of all these bills I'm going to outline. They either deal directly with funding or they put some conditions on that funding like this one tried to do. So I'd imagine these various constraints might percolate through the budget process and we'll see where they end up. So it's needless to say then that it's expected the budget process could take considerable time and go well beyond that 100th day of the session. So with that, here's a list of bills just briefly cover. House Bill 2213 would have given a TPT exemption for residential utilities. Of course, this would have affected RTA revenues. There are several different TPT bills floating around. This one seemed to have the greatest impact given, at least according to my back of the envelope calculations, that RTA revenues, 8% were composed of utilities, residential and commercial over the last 5 years. Half of that was about residential. However, this bill has become a strike everything amendment. Now it relates to a completely different matter with child services, I believe. Senate Bill 1065 is going to be that appropriations bill for I-10 widening from Casa Grande to Chandler. There was a companion House bill, that one's kind of stalled. Senate Bill 8 moving through. That would give $360 million from the general fund and would include funding for both the construction as well as the federal matching monies. It was recently amended to prohibit acceptance of federal funding that require a project component for a bicycle path or a pedestrian walkway. Once again, another one of those conditions that we seem to be adding on to several of these funding mechanisms. This bill is ready for the full consideration in the Senate. And I will remind you that it is an appropriations bill, which to my understanding normally doesn't always get transmitted to the other chamber or eventually end up on the governor's desk. Typically, if appropriations bills pass out of committee, that is a very good sign of their ultimate inclusion in the greater budget at the end of the session. However, the last bill that dealt with I-10 funding did actually clear both chambers and was signed by the governor last May. So we'll keep an eye out on that one for you. Senate Bill 1312 is going to prohibit a state, city, town, county, or political subdivision of the state from considering or establishing any vehicle miles traveled, VMT, reduction goals or targets in developing any transportation or land use planning or selecting transportation or transit projects. As you know, VMT is a proposed way of maybe getting some infrastructure funding since the gas tax is not as efficient as it used to be, hasn't been changed since 1991. Vehicles are getting more fuel efficient, electric vehicles are coming on the scene and so on. This would also prohibit tracking or maintaining a record of a person's vehicle miles traveled by recording the odometer, reading, use of traffic or other cameras or third-party data. And then the main point of the bill, prohibit imposing a fee or tax based on that VMT. This bill did pass out of the Senate and will be heard today at 2 o'clock in the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Senate Bill 1313 is going to prohibit a general plan from including transportation or land use policies or projects that reduce overall system capacity of motor vehicle traffic. Think of like bike and pedestrian lanes, taking out lanes out of roads. And if it does, the general plan should include a study of the level of service on any arterial street to assess the impact of emergency vehicle response times. This bill also passed out of the Senate and will also be heard today at the Transportation Infrastructure Committee of the House on 2 o'clock. Senate Bill 1314 is going to modify required performance variables for ADOT used in evaluating transportation system performance. And for example, it's instead of congestion relief, it's going to say congestion reduction and maybe some other small points that could have a bigger impact. It is going to prohibit the division from considering or adopting motor vehicle mile travel reduction, target or any other demand management policy or project. So there is that provision once again sneaking into this bill. And it would prohibit the performance factors from being applied in a manner that promotes differential treatment or provides special benefits to individuals on the basis of race, color, or ethnicity. This did pass out of the Senate, has been assigned to the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, no hearing scheduled yet. Senate Bill 1340 would prohibit a county board of supervisors from converting a publicly funded roadway or maintained street or highway to a toll road, once again, affecting a source of revenue there. This did pass out of the Senate Transportation and Technology Committee and awaits full Senate consideration. Senate Bill 1697 is going to prohibit ADOT from accepting federal monies to pay for the construction or maintenance or expansion of a highway, state routes, if the federal monies is conditioned on the design or construction of a bicycle path or pedestrian walkway as a component of the highway or state route. This did fail on the Senate floor 15-13, but it looks like it could be considered if there was some Senate impact. Lastly, Senate Concurrent Resolution 1018 once again is bringing up this ban on VMT tax, but because it's a concurrent resolution, it's going to try to put it on the 2024 ballot to amend the Constitution to prohibit the imposition of that tax on VMT. So with that, I think concludes my report on legislative updates, unless you have any questions.
Yeah, Mr. Ortega.
I do. Can you give us an update on the legislation regarding the MAG reauthorization for their sales tax? I think it was the old Prop 400. I don't know what it is now, but.
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Mr. Ortega. Certainly, there are several different bills that are being put to essentially get the legislature and the governor's approval to put MAG's Prop 411 plan on the ballot once again for renewal. And different ones have different provisions. The most interesting one came from the chair of the Senate Transportation Infrastructure Committee, who made some major changes, as you know, compared to what was put forth by MAG. That bill did fail, and I don't think any of the other ones are progressing. It is important to note that MAG's kind of version, or Maricopa County's version of the RTA, it's not even called the RTA, it comes out of completely different legislation than our Pima County RTA. And one kind of enlightening element about our legislation is it does not have to go through the legislature whatsoever. So we do not need that approval, unlike Maricopa County.
Any other questions or items for discussion? Hearing none, thank you, Mr. Ortega. With that, we will adjourn the PAG Management Committee meeting. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Here we've got a few people that are still wandering around, but if we can get into our seat. We'll give,
Jan, will you just get in your seat?
That's what we were waiting.
Carmine.
Thank you,
Good,
Mr.
Carmen.
Dilly.
I was looking for Jan.
But again,
Thank you, Terry, for tracking Jan down.
thank you.
We'll wait for Carmen.
Oh,
We'll give him a couple. Time, we're gonna go and get started. Here comes Carmine. We'll call this meeting to order promptly at about 9:47. So first item on the agenda is the meeting summary of Feb 8. Does everyone have a chance to review the meeting summary? Any comments on that? If none, I'd entertain a motion to approve as submitted.
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Call for the question. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Move on to item 3, RTA Next Plan Development Update. Who is making that presentation?
Pocky.
Pocky, there you are.
Morning, Mr. Chair, and happy March to all members. This is just a quick RTA Next update on some of the Citizens Advisory Committee activities, and our 3 officers are also remotely participating and can chime in as needed. Since you last met on February 8th, the CAC has held 2 meetings at the full committee level. And during those 2 meetings, they've started discussions on the categorical elements, specifically safety and environmental and economic vitality, which I will call EEV moving forward. Those 2 have been the focus for the full committee, while the transit element has been the focus of the subcommittee, which I'll touch on in a minute. But they've continued to discuss the elements. We've provided RTA staff has provided descriptions, criteria, and examples for each of the sub-elements for both of those safety and EEV elements based on the current administrative code to provide the members with information about them. We've also provided them with a draft framework sample ballot for RTA plan so they can start seeing how the draft plan will start looking based on that information. At the last meeting, the members did not move forward any recommendations because they requested additional data on safety and the EEV elements. In the meantime, the CAC Transit Element Subcommittee has also been meeting, and we've also included representatives around the region from the RTA Transit Working Group. They have been extremely helpful and informative in providing the subcommittee members with transit information. The subcommittee members have reviewed all of the transit elements similar to the other 2 I mentioned. They've discussed the funding allocations that they approved in 2020 and are revisiting to see if there are any changes needed. The big thing that we did at the last meeting is we went over the long-range transit regional plan, which was really helpful to understand how the service strategies in that plan correlate to the sub-elements of the transit element. So the subcommittee members continued more discussion on that, and they have also requested additional information from the RTA Transit Working Group. So I have followed up with the working group members in the meantime to ask them about what portion of the proposed investments will be for continuing the RTA funded service enhancements through 2026. I've also asked them to respond on what portion of the proposed investments may be used for new or additional service enhancements. And then I've also asked them how the proposed level of investments in each sub-element will help to meet anticipated service needs over the next 20 years, excuse me. I provided them a deadline of March 15, if they could please respond, and then I will compile that information and provide it to the next CAC Transit Element Subcommittee, and I'll schedule it at that time. In terms of next steps, Mr. Chair and committee members, again, we'll be providing additional data to the CAC members as requested. We're also going to correlate the information to our long-range transportation plan, the RMAP. And then we're hoping to then today, of course, your assignment today is the name project list, moving forward with that. So with that, that's my RTA next update.
Thank you, Bucky. I appreciate that. Tom, I know you and Mary and Carolyn are online. Do you have any commentary, Tom, before I open up to questions of the group?
Yeah, maybe just to add a little flavor to Pocky's presentation. The CAC has received a lot of information and data from various sources, but the sense I got from at least the last couple meetings is that they really feel underprepared, I guess, to evaluate the actual needs within each of the safety sub-elements, and also to really discern the relative importance of each of those sub-elements to the various jurisdictions. And so, as Paki said, we're arranging for some presentations of more data for the committee to consider for each of the sub-elements. And I guess if there's a request, it would be that we also try to get some feedback from individual jurisdictions or the TMC in general about the relative focus that some of these organizations, your organizations, may have from sub-element to sub-element. Some of the elements may be more important to Oro Valley than to ADOT, as just a for instance, and it would be helpful, I think, for the committee to understand that within various areas of the community, certain parts like perhaps pedestrian safety may be overridingly important, and in other areas there may be another sub-element that really is the largest focus. That, I think, will help the committee recognize where as we know, every need is going to exceed the available money coming in from the sales tax, but which ones get most underfunded, if you will, by the RTA is one of the issues I think that the committee is grappling with. So any feedback we can get regarding those relative importances of those sub-elements would also be greatly appreciated.
Hey, Tom, you mentioned that the CAC is needing information or interested in some information. I think Bucky said the same thing in terms of data. What can we do to help? One of the things that we talked about, gosh, probably in an October timeframe, was how the TMC could be a resource to the CAC in terms of helping with the conversations and helping with some of the pieces that are important there. Any ideas or any guidance that you could provide us in terms of things that you're looking for, they're looking for, to maybe help them come up with the game plan, or come up with or get to a point of a consensus, if maybe that's the best word.
Yeah, I think within each sub-element there are similar questions, like how big is the need for bus pullouts, as an example, and how much more important or less important is that than a pedestrian safety sub-element. Those are the kinds of data points, if you will, but kind of feedback of what your departments, what your transportation organizations are seeing as their priorities at current time and into the future. I'm not sure I answered that question very well, and maybe I don't really have the answer for how you can best help us, except to engage and help us see what you're focusing on and how bad the needs are, how underfunded or how much need actually exists. You know, dividing up the money that the board has set aside for safety within each of these elements is going to be very difficult. We're looking at how it was divided in RTA 1, but it would be also helpful to see, just going back to the example of bus pullouts, how much did RTA 1 satisfy the needs that existed at that time, and has that changed what the need is today? So I don't know. I'll stop talking.
So fun.
No, that's helpful. We'll talk you and then we'll come to Farhad. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to follow up on what Tom was saying. So one of the things we want to help the CAC with is, for example, there's 170 million that's been allocated for the safety element by the RTA board. And within the safety element, there are 5 sub-elements. So right now what the CAC wants to know is get information on, for example, intersection safety and capacity improvements. That's one of the sub-elements, for example. You know, what is the data behind that? You know, what percentage should be allocated for that? What percentage was allocated in the previous RTA is something that we've provided to them. Now they're just wanting to look forward. So that's just an example of what they need for all of the 5 sub-elements.
Yeah, that's a good example in that there were a number of intersections that were identified early on in RTA 1 that we won't get to because of funding. And then there's certainly more intersections that likely need some help, and kind of understanding what the magnitude of that need is what I'm trying to get at. Sorry, Farhad.
No
Thanks,
worries,
Tom.
Mr.
Good.
Chair. Just to add to the, at least our understanding of what they're asking for, our understanding was that let's look at what the needs are. And obviously we have the long range plan. The long range plan adopted recently identifies all the needs within the next 25 years. So that's the information we're going to take back to them. Long range plan identified roughly 30 intersections that are in poor or safety needs. So that's the information they're looking for. We're gonna kind of break it down, bring it back to them, and hopefully that gives them that relative perspective. Because when we say set aside $60 million for intersection improvements, they don't know what that 60 million really does for you, right? But if we say we need 30 intersections improved over the next 20 years, and $60 million potentially will handle those 30 intersections, I think that's what they're looking for, and we'll try to do that and get that information to them.
Okay. Questions from the group on this? I will just let you know, did you have a comment?
I was going to say, you do have the list of projects in your packet, and as you can see, we're still looking at roughly $300 million that we need to balance. Any feedback on that would be appreciated. As Tom mentioned earlier, that might be one of the things that we want to be able to provide more feedback. Are those still priorities? If they're not priorities, why? And allow the CAC to hopefully have some additional information before they try to cut another $300 million from the list. In addition to that, we talked about it last time. If anybody was able to bring any local jurisdictional funds to the table. So that information, anything we received to date has been provided in the spreadsheet as well. So we're still looking at $300 million over the 1.1 budget that was the target at the time.
One of the things that, just so that the group knows, yesterday, the mayor and council gave direction for us to move forward with presenting to the RTA board we'll call it the Move Tucson framework, which addresses the sub-elements that Tom was just talking about and tries to mirror those up as best we could. But there is a recommendation that's forthcoming. The project list will be slightly different. I don't think it should cause any heartburn, but there'll be some tweaks based on the Move Tucson criteria. And as I mentioned to you, the issue that we were having was trying to make the project list or the named project list conform to the Move Tucson, which is really our public guiding document by the council. So rather than trying to force fit it, I just said, let's just rethink the whole thing. So that'll be presented here in the not too distant future. And I'll react to that. But Tom, that hopefully could provide at least a portion of the guidance and the thoughts in terms of needs and feedback on those sub elements as well as on the named project. So that should help a little bit. I hope that's the goal anyway. So,
on the topic about jurisdictional contribution. So on the summary sheet, you see what Pima County provided. I see one item on there that's an ADOT project, but the other two don't include or identify non-RTA funding. And I just want to tie that back oh, I'm sorry, they do. So it shows Pima County and ADOT funding. That's correct.
Those are the only ones we've received numbers from.
I thought there were 3 ADOT projects. Is there only 2?
I believe all 3 have those numbers.
They're all there.
Oh, my apologies. Okay, so can you tie back in the packet? There was a summary of the forecasted dollars, 1.6 million, right, over the 2045 time period that it's ASTP and ASTBG, I believe. And so we had talked about at our last discussion of this committee, asking for some scenarios to say how might, right, this number, this gap that we're facing be reduced down by using those dollars. And so how does what's shown on here as far as an ADOT contribution tie back to that $1.6 billion forecasted revenue?
Yeah, so yeah, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to touch on that. Then I'll ask Mr. Lane to chime in. So as you recall, at the last meeting, we discussed about how federal and state funds are allocated through the state to the PAG region for ADOT facilities only. So the memo you have in your packet outlines roughly about $1.6 billion over the remaining 20 years of the RMAP. So the funds are there. So the process, as you recall, the process for programming those funds are up to the regional council in collaboration with ADOT and obviously the ADOT's 5-year planning exercise. So typically those projects follow the 5-year planning process. In this case, if you recall, we said that if the region likes to use some of those funds and include them in the RTA, then the RTA becomes the guiding document for those future boards and future discussions to identify those funds to be used on those projects specifically. So currently what's shown, and we haven't adjusted those numbers, is roughly about 30%, correct me if I'm wrong, it's roughly about 30% of each one of those projects. Again, that's completely, hopefully up to ADOT and the region to decide if that's the right percentages. But we have capacity, and obviously if the region wishes to do that, that's on the regional council side of the business. So ultimately the regional council would have to come back and approve that recommendation. But obviously as part of the RTA process, we can make a recommendation to the regional council.
Rod, did you want to comment on
Yes. So yeah, I agree with Farhad. So I assume those fundings are what would come out of the RAC contribution that goes to the PAG, which is sometimes referred to the ASTBG, and that's what that non-RTA funding would be. But I think kind of the interesting point is something Farhad was touching on, is that if RTA does put funding in these projects, that now becomes a voter approved thing. So the PAG board is, you're kind of leveraging that federal funds now. Because if you don't put the appropriate federal funds for those projects, you have an issue with the RTA funding that was approved by the voters. So it's the mechanism used to kind of leverage the federal funding to get what the region desires.
But I thought that the conversation we had last time was to run scenarios that outlined exactly that, which is how do we take those regional allocated dollars and put them into the program as a scenario for the future. Not all of them, but to some level have that conversation in that 20-year horizon. I mean, if the little table you've got is that attempt, that's fine, but that's basically, I don't think that's all the funding that's coming into the region.
So the memo that's in your packet identifies roughly about, now I forgot the number, but it's about $80 million a year.
Yeah, it's
Total of 1.6 billion
1.6 billion total
for the next 20 years.
But is that all of the funding you're projecting will come into the region, or is that just what you've allocated for the program?
That's all
the gist.
projected for ADOT eligible expenditures coming
That's the total.
to the
potential budget.
region from the state.
So, Mr. Chair, members of the board, can I continue? Can I
Yeah.
expand on that? So that funding is also the funding that is used for the rest of ADOT's program outside of what's presented in RTA. So that you have to weigh that balance, and that's a regional decision on how to weigh that, whether, you know, if we have to maybe not move a different project forward that ADOT as the operator might think is a project that should move forward, but the region feels a different project might be worthy of it. That's reasonable. That's a regional decision, but you are going to have that because the pot is only so big.
Mr. Chair. Oh,
Go ahead, go for it.
so that was right, the idea behind the various scenarios. So if we were to take 300 million of the 1.6 billion, what impact does that have on delivering, right, other ADOT projects in the program? So that, you know, I think in order for us to be able to make a recommendation, seeing that, right, rather than just saying, okay, simply take the 303 million out of the 1.6 billion and put it here, what's the effect of that? We may very well land on that, but understanding what the trade-offs are is what I was hoping to see.
So, Mr. Chair, of course, respond to that. So, I think that would be a combination of the funding that Farhad has laid out in conjunction with the RMAP, because ADOT has put its projects in the RMAP, so we can kind of get that correlation of what ADOT sees, because that's only what ADOT puts in. So, for example, there's projects in here that are not, that we haven't put forth, that have been put forth by other agencies or other jurisdictions that are on the ADOT system, and that's where that comparison could be, because this is what, you know, ADOT has put in what it desires, and it's a fiscally constrained program based on the funding availability. We can then plug in to see if these were to go in, how that funding would be affected.
So I think it's important, though, that we have that discussion. At least that's what I thought we were trying to get to ultimately, is what do those scenarios look like? And quite frankly, you would be an integral part, you and your team would be an integral part of that, because you could guide us and you could say, hey, this, but you know, I know that you entity or agency think that this interchange or this particular project on the system is important, but let me give you some other thoughts in terms of other priorities. And yes, certainly deferring to the RTA board for the conversation around this, you know, the RTA projects, but I for one would want to understand what the recommendation would be from the resident experts at ADOT. But that's just my gut. the only way to do that is to run the scenarios on where we're headed.
So if I may, I'm gonna ask Mr. Farhad if the director Farhad, if that is a role that he sees PAG to function, because I'd be more than happy to cooperate and to sit down and kind of develop this information in something that could be presented to this body for that discussion. Is that something that you would see PAG be involvement in?
So, Mr. Chair, again, just to provide some context here. So within the RMAP, we have a list of ADOT projects that currently add up to the 1.6 billion. And so the exercise, if I understand what you're talking about doing, would be to look at that list and then come back and say, all right, we want to prioritize these 5 projects out of that list and commit those funds today instead of over the next 20 years. That's really the exercise. So yes, we have the list. We can demonstrate which projects are being prioritized. Let's assume there's 5 projects moving forward, 10 left on the RMAP. So now you have a list of those 10 projects that are in the RMAP that are not being prioritized and will have to be addressed in the next 20 years over the life of the RMAP updating process. Those projects may fall out in the future because those dollar amounts may not come in at that amount. But we can't answer that question today. All we can tell you is that you're advancing, prioritizing 5 projects and leaving 10 on the list. That's really the exercise. Otherwise, we're not getting to the level of deciding what to do with the other 10 projects. So you're understanding, hopefully, that that's really all we can do.
Right.
Unless you want to decide how to prioritize the remaining 10 projects, which is way beyond the scope of RTA.
If I may, I think that that's the appropriate place to do that. The appropriate data that we have to make those decisions, the best data that we have to make those decisions. It's the only view we have, I think, for what Carmine was asking. And if there's a way that I have all kinds of tech spreadsheets running around my head about how to show that right now. But I do think I'd be more than happy to sit down with your staff and kind of put this together with your folks, my folks, for something that we can have a discussion about.
Yeah,
I would like to see that next time if you could do that. I think that would be of value. I think that was what we're hoping to see. So I think that would be.
Yeah, again, I want to make sure everybody understands that. So basically, we're prioritizing a few, and the balance, we can't make a decision until some future date.
We're not necessarily looking for a decision. I think we're looking for some thoughts and guidance on what that plan can look like.
Yeah.
Curtis, I see you've had your hand up, and I know you've been very patient there. Thank you. So go ahead.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I think this is a helpful discussion. Seems like we're starting to flesh out some details. Related to that, I had one request and one comment. The request is that when we have the updates, if we could also be reminded of where we are on the calendar. And related to that is, I'm wondering if there's an updated calendar someplace that's available to not only committee members, but the public. Someplace on the RTA website. The other thing that's of interest to me, and we heard it in the management committee meeting right before this, is that there's a very clear definition between the responsibilities and the roles of PAG as the MPO and the RTA as a special taxation district. And I'm wondering how we are formally transferring funds, the regional funds from the Pima Association of Governments bucket into the Regional Transportation Authority bucket, so that there's complete transparency with not only the jurisdictions, but also the public that this is happening. So if we can discuss that a little bit, I think it'd be helpful.
Sure, Mr. Chair, I can respond to that. So it's similar to what we just talked about earlier. If there are any non-RTA dollars, obviously the entity that is offering those dollars through some resolution would essentially commit those funds to the RTA proposed 20-year plan. So I'll use Pima County, for example. You provided a list. Ultimately, we would request a formal resolution from Pima County identifying that those dollars will be committed to these projects over the next 20 years. Same thing applies to the PAG side of the business. So PAG Regional Council will have a resolution and identify that over the next 20 years, these federal or state dollars can be committed to individual projects. And that'll be a resolution by Regional Council committing those future dollars to the RTA plan. And then ultimately the plan itself demonstrates where those funds are coming from. And once approved by the voters, then that becomes really the blueprint for future boards and regional councils to continue to provide those funds to those individual projects.
Yeah, thank you. My point is more about, I think, the transparency of Farhad. How does the public know and how do they know what alternatives are being foregone by transferring regional money to the RTA? I mean, I know we have public meetings, but are there public hearings on this mass transference of funds from the MPO to the RTA?
Mr. Chair, again, as you recall, the outreach on the RTA will be very extensive, and we will identify any proposed non-RTA dollars to be used to leverage RTA projects. So that will be a very extensive process with a feedback loop, and then ultimately an action by the board, ultimately an action by the public. So it'll be very transparent what is being proposed by the time it's on the ballot.
Where does the regional council fit in? You mentioned the RTA planning process. You mentioned the RTA board action. Where does the Pima Association of Governments take a clear and a definitive action that they're transferring X hundreds of millions of dollars that could ostensibly have been prioritized into other projects? Where is that made perfectly clear to the public?
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, it'll be similar to any other entity that there'll be a resolution by the regional council identifying which funds are being committed to which projects.
So there's no public debate.
The public debate hopefully comes through the RTA process and making those proposed funds available for RTA plan. And the resolutions will come most likely prior to approval of the RTA plan by the board and then vote of the public. So later in the process, we would request anyone that is bringing any funds to the table to provide those resolutions of commitments of those funds. Same applies to the PAG Regional Council.
Okay. Thank you. I'm still seeing a lot of smudginess on this. I'm not seeing a level of transparency that I think we should have, but we can discuss that at another time. So getting back to my previous comment about a calendar, can we get a commitment to update us at our meetings with a calendar and to possibly have that on the website someplace?
Mr. Chair, if I may, and Kurt, I did not bring up the calendar today because the milestones are still the same as the ones that you received in your previous packet, but I will make sure to speak on it at the next meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Well, it'll be helpful knowing us, letting us know where we are on our odometer as we try to get to the ballot on this. Thank you.
Okay, any other, thank you, Curtis. Any other?
Mr. Chair, can we just hear maybe a brief update from the other jurisdictions who haven't identified local funds and whether that's, you spoke that the mayor and council acted, but from the other perspectives.
Else,
yeah, thanks for that. I'll just be quite candid. I mean, that we don't have an impact fee revenue stream for our projects. We take exactions on rezoning type things and developments on a case-by-case basis. And so we just quite frankly didn't have any to offer. If the mandate was in place to have local funds put on the table, the two projects that we have here would probably consume all of our capital for the next foreseeable future. So that's why we didn't respond. Actually, we responded, but that's the information that we provided PAG when they inquired.
Yeah, so from our position, I think it's no different than the last meeting. And that is, we'll have a budget that we're going through, a retreat that we'll have with the council next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We'll talk primary topics of conversation is going to take an entire day is transportation. It's one area where that we'll be looking at and talking about. Whether or not there'll be actual money for these projects or not, I don't know.
I think I mentioned it similar to Mr. Dilly previously as well, but just our focus is our capital improvement program that we exist for existing facilities. We are looking at impact fees and whether or not that's an option, but that just takes away from safety improvements and other intersections within our town. And it, quite frankly, looking at some of the numbers is probably a couple million, which I don't think is going to move the needle much, but we are looking at if we can offer up something along those lines.
Any other jurisdictions? And as I said, we'll be submitting something here in the not too distant future, including a conversation around impact fees as well. It's like you all, it's hard to predict, but we're gonna look at something as well. Any other questions or comments on this agenda item? All right, hearing none. Oh,
I was going to say before we move on to the next item, feel free to give us any updates, any changes to the list. Again, that's our goal, to make adjustments to the list before we go back to the CAC. So the easiest part would be that if there are anything on here that are not a priority to you and you would like the CAC to have that conversation, please let us know so we can convey that to them.
very good. When's the next CAC meeting?
At the moment, it's scheduled for March 20 and
March 20th.
March 20th.
Thanks. Okay, next item, RTA next cost estimate. Rick?
You guys all hear me? Okay, yeah, works okay. Okay. Just wanted to take a few minutes and give you a quick update. It's more of a status on kind of how we're approaching the cost estimating on this. Just want to give you a preview of what's going to be coming down the pipeline. We're actually working with the consultant team that's going to be assisting with this. We're working on the scope and fee as we speak, and then we're working to reach out to the jurisdictional representatives that have been identified by your various transportation departments. So those meetings and overviews are going to be set up here in the upcoming next week or two, is the current pace I've got in mind. Our overall approach is that we want to take the design to about a 15% level. That's a reasonable amount. That's similar to what we did last time. That's typical with conceptual efforts, but we want 30% logic and rationale. We want to try and take advantage of every lesson learned over the last 15 years or greater to be able to apply them and say, what will we do differently? What will we do better? And what do we need to apply? So that's the monumental task that we're going to try to apply across to all of them. We're evaluating the 37 new name projects that's on the list in front of you, plus we're adding the 4 that are being deferred so that we're on a level playing field for all 41 projects. As you recall, those projects that hadn't had that exercise or level of effort merely were updated as part of our map. They continued with updates to the various provisions, but they've not had that same level of detail analysis on there. We want to be able to bring that up so that we have an apples and apples comparisons across the board. The design software, fortunately, technology has evolved an awful lot for us in the last 15 years. And essentially, we get to use 3D modeling capability. We get to build what the roadway is going to look like and then look and say, how do we best fit that? How do we assemble that? What's that going to look, taste, and feel like? So to that, we're going to be working with the jurisdictions to identify what's a typical cross-section in an urban center going to look like, what's a more rural one going to be, what's the appropriate configuration of all the features and elements, and then lay that in. We have that capability. So thus, we're not going to have to use a standard assumed 4-lane, typical median separated 12-foot dimension on lane. We can do a little customizing to make sure we're looking at site-specific conditions. Contingencies. So pulling upon some of the guidelines we've read about, Curtis had shared the federal highways guidelines, but it's stuff we knew about too, and some of the lessons learned. Contingencies are going to be applied a lot more strategically through there. So projects that are at a 30% level would have a different contingency than some that are at the conceptual level. Projects involving the railroad are going to have a radically different contingency than something that's straightforward in a wide open area. So those will be picked and choose. We're not going to apply just a blanket 15% across the board and say, I hope that covers it. Now, we are right this second planning on applying project level contingency at amount still to be determined to recognize the volatility. This committee's talked a lot about that, of the bidding market and the climate we're in now. So we recognize that while we have unknowns that are going to be specific to the elements, We are in a volatile market and we'll try to reflect that and capture that as well as possible. Like I said, we're going to be reaching out with the jurisdictions. I've already made contact and gotten responses from several of them of who the detailed staff are going to be that we're going to be working closely with, laying out the overview and then the questions and answers, the reviews, the dialogue. The board timeframe, Pocky's mentioned it. We're still held by that unless something changes on that. So we're setting this in place so that it's going to be quick. It is aggressive, but we want to make sure it's holistic and inclusionary so that we've got team members sitting there going, that's the number I'd use too. That's the approach I'd use too. Sounds good. Because at the end of the day, when all the leaves come out of the tree, they're the ones that get to implement this. So we want to make sure that, yes, I can deliver, implement as originally envisioned. So that's why it'll be so intensive with that effort. With that, that's our quick overview. We haven't, like I said, we've met, we've laid out strategies, we're talking, we'll be reaching out to the jurisdictions to schedule meetings, but that's our overall approach. And if this, I can answer any questions.
Thank you, Rick. Questions from the group?
Mr. Chair, I have a question. Thanks. Rick, you mentioned that you're going to include the 4 deferred projects.
Yes.
RTA 1 in your modeling. Will there be an opportunity to have conversations about what the configuration of those projects look like in terms of developing 15% plans?
Yes, we're taking what's been given as feedback as the baseline of the starting scope items. Obviously, Silver Bell's been identified, First Ave North, the Houghton, but yes, we'll be following up. And that's going to be the purpose of those discussions is to make sure, do we have this scope item elements, assumptions, the desired outcome for all that stuff included.
Hey, Rick, that brings up a point. I know Silver Bell there was conversation about a potential change in cross section. I assume that the new estimate would incorporate the potential change in that.
Correct. That had gone to a 4-lane that would be continuous through there. So yeah, we're going to be basing it on that discussion for that revised configuration.
Other questions?
To share one other question.
Oh.
On the cost estimates, you mentioned you're going to build in some project contingencies. Are you taking a look at year of delivery in terms of, whether it's delivered in year 1 versus year 20 and how you're building in inflation on those cost estimates, or just a straight line?
Straight line at this point in time, recognizing that the year of delivery, the particular phase breakout for how that will be implemented is still a discussion to be had so that we know that escalation will be taken into account as we identify how these are going to be implemented over the 20-year period. So we'll have an level playing platform. It could be evil too, I ain't gonna lie. It will be a level platform on that. And then as those discussions go forward, we'll know which ones we have to inflate and escalate.
And that'll be $2023.
Correct. Yeah, we're going to try to make that today, 2023, recognizing we've got a lot of capital projects that are on deck that we haven't got actual bids comments or bid prices in, but we've got pricing through some of the CMAR efforts, active jobs ADOT's got going on. So we recognize that at least there's some dynamics in play that we can take into account.
So I would suggest not today, but in the not too distant future, we should probably have a conversation about inflation part of this discussion. And whether it's factored in as a separate line item or part of contingency or what, I think that's an important conversation to have down the road. Thank you, Rick.
That was kind of the big main thing, is recognizing that's going to have to be a separate, and that's going to correlate to how's the phasing, the individual implementation, which projects is major corridors similar to a Houghton or Tangerine, maybe spread out over periods. That dynamic will have to come into play, but we as a estimating team didn't want to go down that rabbit hole of just radical assumptions. So,
other questions? Bill?
Mr. Chairman, Rick, these costs that you projected, these are right-of-way acquisition, construction cost, design, inspection. I mean, it's full costs.
Fully loaded.
Okay.
It's going to have everything in there.
Case, yeah, good.
And yeah, like I said, big lessons learned from a lot of the other ones. That's that 30% awareness type of thing. Silver Bell. Okay, now we know. Cultural is going to have a much bigger play, much bigger price tag. Thank goodness we do have 2 projects right now active underway. Well, 3 that have railroad inclusion. So we'll have a much better idea of how we'll handle the railroad aspects of it. But they will be fully loaded. You will see them broken out into the categories similar to how projects do now. So we're going to try to use a format that's consistent with what the other deliveries are in the region.
Thanks.
Other questions for Rick? Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Future agenda items. Does anybody have any future agenda items to bring forth? Sam?
I just heard you earlier say that we'd like that presentation from ADOT for the next meeting. So
Does that need to be a separate agenda item, do you think, or is that something you can do under the RTA next? Should we separate the conversations out, do you think?
That's RTA next, engineering that conversation. Yeah.
I would think it would be relevant to our community. Okay, as long as it's the language is clear that we're gonna be talking about that, which may not be the RTA project specifics, but also the program as on a bigger scale. Yeah, I'm okay with that. Okay, good, thanks. Any other agenda items?
Mike,
Oh, somebody.
that was Curtis.
Oh, hey, Curtis.
Yeah, I had two related items, and they both relate to schedule. Excuse me. The first is there seems to be a lack of clarity in the statutes about once the voters approved RTA next, the effective dates of the next of the continuation of the sales tax. The sales tax portion of the statutes in Title 42 says that the tax will be effective either January 1st or July 1st, whichever happens right after the voter approval. The revisions to Title 48, which is the special taxation district, says that the new tax goes into effect on April Fool's Day, basically on April 1st, and it trumps the no pun intended the language in Title 42. So I think that's worthwhile talking about because it could affect the schedule and the decision of the RTA board. And related to that, there's been quite a bit of conversation, both today and at yesterday's mayor and council meeting about what's happening in Maricopa County in the legislature and with MAG. I recognize that their statutes are different than ours, but they are virtually identical in dealing with the duration of the tax, which is a 20-year period, which I think is why MAG is expecting some legislative approval. Our language says exactly the same thing, that the plan is for 20 years. There's no language that says a renewal is possible, and there's no language that says a renewal is prohibited. So I think we need to be 105% positive that we don't have to go back to the legislature to get an approval. I don't want an answer on that today. I'm just hoping that we can, get that clarified and get it in writing, because we don't want to get to a position where we're ready to go out for the vote on this, and somebody like the Goldwater Institute comes in and challenges us in court. So it's just a scheduling and a homework exercise, some clarification, and I think the appropriate venue is for the TMC to look at that and then take it up to the board. So that's my suggestion, Mike.
Thank you. So on the first one, the schedule, that can be part of the RTA next discussion for next time. So that would be a new agenda item. So if you could just make sure to give us that information as a part of the RTA next development. And then on the second one, I think that could be under legislative update next time. What the question that I asked during that time was specific to the relationship or the similarities between MAG and PAG, and I think you answered that. But if you could just delve into that a little bit more under legislative update next time, I think those two can be covered. Any other new agenda items for the future? And hearing none, we stand adjourned properly at 10:34. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.